what's actually going on in the minds of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Now that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has entered its 5th year, it can sometimes feel like the peace talks to end this war are on repeat.
So that's why today we're talking to someone who knows this story from the inside, Fiona Hill.
She's someone who, over her career, has sat down with both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, two key players in the negotiation to end this war. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid.
And I'm Tristan Redman. Welcome to The Global Story on YouTube.
A lot of people in the U.S. might remember Fiona Hill because of her testimony during the impeachment hearings of Donald Trump in 2019. But that is not our focus today. Fiona Hill is a Russia expert who worked in the first Trump White House, and long before that, she first met Vladimir Putin. It was 2004, just a few years after he had taken power. At the time, Putin was fighting a war in a part of Russia called Chechnya. Separatists wanted to break away. Putin wanted to stop them. And that September in 2004, Chechen extremists took a school hostage. Putin sent in a rescue operation, but despite those efforts, more than 300 people died. And it was just a few days after that tragedy at the school when Fiona Hill first met Vladimir Putin. And that's what I began our conversation with. I caught up with Fiona Hill in our Washington, D.C. studios.
I was in Russia at the time, and we had a planned meeting with Putin. There was all kinds of people invited who were experts on Russia, journalists, former politicians, for example. So I was one of this group. And to be honest, we were quite surprised that Putin still decided to meet with the group.
Given just
what had happened. Because,
time, yeah.
I mean, it wasn't exactly, a great success for the Russian security services. Putin intended to use this for every opportunity to pass on messages. And the messages was one of, of hostility, here. And what you get from that kind of impression is that, yes, you did. It was very tense. It was personal. He responds in a kind of visceral way. Putin used the occasion to say that this is what happens when people try to tear off juicy morsels from Russian territory. And for the journalists and others who were there at the time, that it was all very striking. But this was also a lesson in how Putin stages an event. So we were waiting for hours, which is, again, a very classic part of Putin's shtick here with anybody. I mean, the more you wait, the more you get that kind of sense that he doesn't respect the people that he's meeting with, that this is part of the whole process. People were getting plied not just with tea, but with also with alcohol. So let's just say that, a lot of people felt quite uncomfortable by the time that Putin arrived because they wanted to go to the bathroom. They don't want to run out and go to the bathroom and miss him coming because, they might not be let back into the room. And I mean, this may seems somewhat humorous, but it was all kind of part of that atmosphere of you're waiting for the man to arrive.
I want to ask you about Putin and his ambitions in the region. And it was a few years after 2004, where at the Munich Security Conference, Putin gave this really assertive speech. I'm sure you recall this. He really was signaling that Russia was upset with U.S. foreign policy. And I mean, just for listeners who may not be familiar, the Munich Security Conference is this big get-together of leaders and diplomats from around the globe. And so to me, it is notable that he made this speech in this setting. And what did you think at the time? And what was going on? And why was he signaling this approach at that time period?
This was in February 2007. So it's 3 years, give or take, after the incidents and the episode in Beslan that we've just talked about. And what Putin was basically saying was that Russia had reached a watershed moment. By this point, the war in Chechnya is not resolved, but the Russian special services have got this in hand in a pretty brutal fashion. Putin's feeling more confident about his ability to keep Russia together internally. And it's also significant, Russia had been pretty much bankrupt, and Putin has actually successively paid off Russian debts. And the Russian economy is starting to pick up because you have oil prices starting to pick up. And Putin is basically
the United States, right?
That's right. So Putin actually feels that he can actually speak out more now. So that's exactly it. He starts to chastise the United States for thinking it's the lone superpower. Because, of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War, the United States basically enjoys this unipolar moment. this is the so-called end of history, the whole idea that everything is converging together and the United States is riding high. And Putin is basically saying, hang on a minute, that is not the case. But Putin is basically saying, Russia is coming back.
And so that's his message.
I'm putting you on notice that we're back, and don't you mess around with us anymore.
And so that's his message in 2007. If we then fast forward to 2014, after protesters in Ukraine overthrew a pro-Russian president, Putin goes on to annex Crimea in eastern Ukraine. And there was a push within some in the federal government at that point in time to arm Ukraine with powerful javelin missiles. And you openly opposed that position at that time. What about Putin's mindset made you think that that could backfire?
Well, there's a number of factors here. You see, we're talking about this as if it's the US and Russia all in a vacuum. But there were so many other factors at play all the way along there. And in the case of Ukraine at this point in 2014 and, kind of what happens in the run-up to the decision to annex Crimea, the real drama is about Europe. In 2008, of course, Putin has pushed back against NATO summit in Bucharest in Romania, in which an open door was given to Ukraine and Georgia about joining NATO. This is the period when they basically intervene in Georgia after a military skirmish, military exchange between the Georgians and one of their own separatist regions of South Ossetia. So that
were you concerned about the repercussions?
Yes, of course, the repercussions.
What repercussions were you concerned about?
What I was concerned about was, in fact, our assumption at the time was that the Russians would take some kind of military action or certainly forceful action in response, as it in fact turned out that they did against Georgia in August of 2008. And so that if we were going to make any kind of undertaking to bring Ukraine closer to NATO, then we would have to factor all of these things in. We weren't saying that you necessarily should not pursue closer relationships, but you have to factor in that Russia was going to react in a certain way.
Understanding Putin as a whole, do you feel like you have a theory about how best to approach him and when it merits and how you push back?
You have to be always consistent and clear, and you have to be prepared, for a very forceful reaction from him. So you have to have thought it through. And you always have to be prepared to stand up and confront Putin, because he will respond, he will react. And so unless we're prepared to push back, then, we shouldn't go down a course of action in the first place. That's really basically the fundamental point that I'm trying to get across here. And when we're engaging with Russia, we have to be firm, and we have to be very clear, and we have to be consistent, and we have to be able to defend ourselves in whatever fashion that merits, given the respective issue. Pandering to Putin, trying to bribe Putin, trying to flatter Putin, trying to incentivize Putin, with promises of all kinds of economic largesse, that is just not going to work.
Let's pivot now to President Trump. The other part of some sort of peace negotiation settlement. I mean, we've seen him certainly believe that you can sit down and try to negotiate this all with Putin. And so I think if we are trying to understand if a negotiated peace settlement is possible, it's worth understanding more about President Trump. And I want to begin with your period working with him in his first administration. In 2017, you joined the White House, the National Security Council. Can you walk us through that decision? Why did you decide to join?
I was asked because I'd already been in this role in the National Intelligence Council. People knew me as apolitical, non-political, non-partisan, not ideological, and that, I was steeped in what was going on in Russia. And, a lot of people said to me, look, I won't forgive you for doing this because you'll be making yourself complicit in whatever happens next. And I did think about that. I never stopped thinking about it. But I thought it was worth the effort. At least I could, try to do something in that context. There was a feeling, after the Russian intervention, everything that had been happening, that our house was on fire. And if you're standing there, just watching things burn down, you don't feel that you can do something. I used to joke, save the goldfish, or, kind of run in and grab the cat.
After Russia
or,
intervention,
hold
just
a
to be
hose
clear,
pipe.
you're referring to...
I'm going back, to the intervention in the elections in 2016.
After 2016.
Yeah. I mean, it was obvious that we were in a very dangerous period, and that's basically how, I came in, at least to give an honest appraisal of where the Russians were coming from. And look, if there ever is an opening, if there ever is a moment where, basically somebody wants to stop or change direction, you've got to be ready. And so that was certainly my belief, and that was my purpose in going in. The possibilities of doing something to change the trajectory, the very dangerous trajectory of US-Russian relations.
You mentioned this idea of being a part of negotiations and understanding what makes a person tick. So let's actually talk more about what makes President Trump tick. And I want to jump ahead to what I believe was kind of around the middle of your time in the administration. There is this moment in 2018. It was a headline-grabbing news summit between Putin and Trump in Helsinki. And I want to zero in on this scene because I think it says a little bit about both men. I'd like you to walk us through specifically the angle here with President Trump. And what was it like to prep him? What was the goal going into the summit?
Well, first of all, it's extremely difficult to prep President Trump. He's just not interested in it. And that's part of the whole dilemma. Putin is very well prepared. He was also trained in the KGB. He's trained how to manipulate people. He's very good at it. President Trump thinks that just his entire life story just prepares him for these kinds of meetings. It's just a deal.
So did he prep ahead of Helsinki?
He did not deal. He did not prep. He just wants to make a deal.
Did you try to prep?
We tried to prep, writ large, tried to prep him in many different ways. We flew out the ambassador at the time, John Huntsman, to DC. He just didn't bother to engage. We had all kinds of different briefing. I mean, he did listen to his CIA briefers and the head of the CIA at different points, but nobody's really prepped him from what it was going to be like to meet with Putin. And the person who ended up prepping him was actually the president of Finland, because we were there in Helsinki. He had met with Putin more times than enough. And in the breakfast where they're supposed to be talking about Finnish-US relationships, we'd asked the Finns, I mean, sort of somewhat of desperation, and we had very good relations with them, would President Niinistö of Finland be willing to talk about what it's like meeting with Putin.
That is a wild story.
And that is exactly what we did. We asked the Finns to do it.
To brief the president.
Because
on what it was like to engage with
exactly
Putin.
Right. And of course in Finland, just like in Iceland and Geneva and many other kind of places, there had been in the past these summits, these really momentous summits between US and Soviet leaders and later Russian leaders to talk about arms control. And that's really what President Trump wanted to do. He wanted to sit down with President Putin and make a big arms control deal. President Trump didn't have the patience, the strategic patience and the focus to actually take forward the issues that he really wanted to work on, because he was too much thinking all the time about the hyper-personalized nature of the relationship that he wanted to have with Putin. He wanted Putin to like him. He wanted Putin to respect him. He wanted to have his moment with Putin, because for him, Putin is another great world leader. Trump does not think of many people out there as his peers. Putin was one of them. And so for him, the main issue was sitting down with President Putin and getting on with their meeting.
I think the moment that so many of us here in the United States recall from that press conference was when President Trump was asked about interference in the 2016 election. And he said that President Putin says it's not Russia. I don't see any reason why it would be. And this was after he acknowledged that his own director of national intelligence had said it was Russia. So, I mean, that is kind of the headline-grabbing moment that I think so many of us paid attention to here in the United States. What was going through your mind as the meeting wrapped up, as that press conference wrapped up, and you flew home?
Well, it was an absolute mess, an absolute debacle. And, I mean, I, like everybody else in the team around Trump, just wanted it to end, because that just sets off everything in a completely and utterly different direction. I mean, we were not going to stabilize the relationship then, because look, it was understandable that everybody wanted to focus on what Trump knew or thought about the intervention in the election. But for Trump, he's only thinking about his personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, and he feels all the time that he's been totally thwarted by the media and everybody else's scrutiny on the election. He also doesn't want to admit to himself that maybe he might have not really won the election by fair means. I don't think we ever had any evidence that the election had been tipped by Putin, but the point of the Russian interference, particularly in trying to shape people's opinions, is you can never really tell, because the margins were so small in the election, in the Electoral College. And so all of this is going on in Trump's...
How you interacted with the president, or what you thought of how to interact with him?
It made us, start to really kind of think here that we were going to have to try to be much more creative in the way that we shaped Trump's views, because he's not listening to anybody. And we need to find ways of getting across to him.
And you trusted Putin, it was clear to you.
Oh, of course he trusted Putin,
and
because Putin is his peer. So the real problem is, how do you get the president, to trust everyone else? And I think, we failed miserably at that, because Trump does not trust the intelligence services because he thinks they're out to get him. He doesn't trust anybody who is not personally loyal to him. For me personally, I'd never really got much traction with him. I wasn't to him, the kind of person he wanted to listen to. He didn't even listen, to Rex Tillerson, who was the Secretary of State, or General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. He just saw everybody as his staff. Trump is something of an outlier in the way that he looks at Putin. That doesn't make him right. There are many, people who make this case that Trump is a non-conventional, unconventional thinker. Very true, that he often sees things that other people don't see. That's correct. But with Vladimir Putin, he's clearly blinkered, and he sees Putin as just another guy, just as another, kind of perhaps ruthless business person that he can deal with. But Putin is a lot more than that.
So let's skip now to the present time period. We're having this conversation in the context of it now being 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We have seen the West, we've seen the United States impose a lot of sanctions. We've also seen them offer military aid to Ukraine, and yet the war has continued on and on. We've also now seen President Trump in his second term initiate these talks to end the war. He had said that he could solve it very quickly, that he would do it within, I believe, 24 hours, essentially a day of returning to the White House. And yet it has proved much more intractable of a problem for him to resolve. And so this, I think, leads me to the really overarching question I've had throughout our conversation, Fiona, which is, in understanding both of these men, is a negotiated peace possible?
Well, the two of them are negotiating about their own relationship. Let me be very clear. We are not really talking about here a negotiated peace in Ukraine, because President Trump still wants to have a personal relationship with Putin, and he wants to change the nature of the bilateral US-Russia relationship, which is what he was also trying to do at Helsinki, and Ukraine is in the way. So what President Trump is trying to do is get Ukraine out of the way. And again, as I also said, we're not operating in a vacuum here. Ukraine is a critical issue for the future of European security, and the Europeans are just a kind of Greek chorus, occasionally called up, mostly by Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, when he feels desperate. But President Trump doesn't view them as relevant at all, and that's also the same for Putin. Putin wants this to be a bilateral, high-level, skip everybody else discussion with the United States. And while that all happens, the war will continue. And if we look at Chechnya, which we started off talking about, it was resolved because Putin found a proxy to run Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. Putin's preference for resolving Ukraine is the same thing, to put in his own proxy. And that's what he intended to do when he invaded Ukraine 4 years ago. He had a proxy in mind, maybe several succession of proxies in mind. He wanted to get rid of Zelensky. It was supposed to be a special military operation, and instead it's turned out to be the largest land war in Europe since World War II. So
you don't sound optimistic.
I'm not optimistic in the way that we are talking about this right now. What Putin is negotiating now, or trying to negotiate, is President Trump handing over Ukraine to him, forcing Ukrainians to capitulate, forcing there to be new elections in Ukraine, even perhaps prior to a peace settlement, and having a new leader, which becomes a kind of a proxy, and basically demilitarizing, neutralizing and neutering Ukraine, so that Ukraine doesn't really exist as the country that it is now, and turns it into essentially Belarus, which is a country that is heavily dependent on Russia and in a union arrangement with Russia. That's the kind of, the sort of the best scenario. And that is not in the interest of the Ukrainians right now. That's not what they want to negotiate.
So how does this ultimately resolve?
It resolves when Putin is blocked from being able to go any further in terms of taking territory and realizes that he can't fight anymore, and when he has some other incentives to stop. And that might be negative incentives rather than positive incentives. He's not going to stop because he thinks he's going to have $1 trillion, which is one of the latest things, trillions of dollars of investment, which are highly unlikely and very improbable and maybe not even feasible, by the United States. And he's not going to stop because he likes President Trump. I mean, I actually do think it will stop at some point. I do have more optimism, but I think we have to really work at it, and we can't just leave it.
Because the scenarios you outlined.
We have to expand it beyond just this thinking about Putin and Trump. Putin won't like it, Trump won't like it, but they are not the only two actors in this universe. And it will not end by any kind of bilateral agreement between Russia and the United States. Neither of them can bring this to the end that this very complex war requires.
And so who do you see stepping up?
I see this as having to be a much more well thought through collective effort at peacemaking involving Europeans. It doesn't have to be all of Europe. It doesn't have to be the EU specifically, but there are many European countries that have vested interests.
Do you think the Trump administration really sees Europe in that
No, they do
vein,
not.
Though, of
and
power?
That is the problem. That is the problem.
That's the thing I find really strange to compute about the Trump administration strategy here, because you say that he wants to cut Ukraine out of the equation, essentially just negotiate this agreement with Putin.
Yep.
He did promise to end the war very quickly, and while he has met with Putin, one-on-one, famously himself there in Alaska, right, to try to negotiate the end of this war, he has also at times, at least on social media, publicly criticized Putin's actions, called on him to stop bombing. I think at one point he called Putin absolutely crazy for this barrage of strikes on Ukraine. He has been publicly critical of the Russian leader at times.
I mean, what it is he doesn't understand Putin. He proves over and over again that he doesn't understand him, because this is not crazy from Putin's point of view. It's only crazy from Trump's point of view. Because for Putin, he's willing to pay any price to get full control of Ukraine, and he'll get it one way or another, he thinks.
So
either on the military, on the battlefield.
You that Trump does not understand
Trump does not understand him. He doesn't understand his thought process. And to his credit, he doesn't understand why anybody would preside over this mass slaughter of his own people, not just over Ukrainians. But that's what Putin is prepared to do. For Putin,
and do you think Putin understands Trump's thinking?
I think Putin understands Trump extremely well. And
Which is what? What is Trump's thinking?
Because Putin knows that Trump wants the credit for solving this for himself, and Putin's not going to give him that. Trump has been unbelievably transparent. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants the credit for solving the problem, solving the war in Ukraine. I don't care who solves this, in my view, and I'm sure that most Ukrainians don't either, but they want a just ending to this war that doesn't leave them at risk of further predatory action from Russia.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Asma. Thank you for having me.
That's it from us today. If you enjoyed our episode, I've got to mention that The Global Story is also available as an audio podcast. You can find us every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.